So thank you for everyone who made it in the morning, and thank you for everyone who just joined us. My name is Alexandra. I am the leader of the Ukraine Working Group, and we're very grateful to have you here today. And the second half of our conference is going to focus on Ukraine's reconstruction and thinking in the post-war perspective. So it's my honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. So please, let's give a round of applause. No, it's, I'm not going to say it. It's up to you. What do we think? Yeah, it'll be better. Dr. Polyakova is going to give us some remarks on her vision of the post-war reconstruction, and we'll follow with that our chat and Q&A session. So you'll have a good opportunity to present all your questions. Thank you.
So I actually didn't prepare any lecture. I thought we were just going to have a conversation about the current situation. But I'm glad to be here. I always like doing these kinds of sessions with AHS. I'm not sure if this is working or not. Okay. Can you guys hear me? All right. So I'd rather just have a conversation with everyone as opposed to a lecture. You're probably pretty used to lectures these days. I know the topic of this session is about Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction, but I think it's very difficult to have this conversation at the current moment given how quickly the situation is changing in the geopolitical space, especially with the new administration. We're literally living through a very rapid change of what seems to be U.S. policy vis-a-vis Russia's invasion of Ukraine more broadly, and of course there's a supposed peace deal that's being negotiated right now. So I think it's very difficult to talk about any plan for recovery and reconstruction as a result of that. A couple of things I would say about it is that the contours of what Ukraine looks like after the war, because it's very difficult to talk about reconstruction when Ukraine is actively being destroyed, will to a great extent be determined by what's happening right now at the so-called negotiating table between the United States and Russia, where Ukraine must play a key role and a deciding role in whether they will implement whatever agreement is ultimately comes out of these negotiations, if there is an agreement that comes out of these negotiations. So I think I'm going to stop there and have anybody ask any questions you might have about anything that's going on this topic now.
So let's proceed with the Q&A. We'll pass out the microphone so that can be easy.
I guess, yeah. So my name's Julian, I'm undergrad at UU. So I'd just like to ask my first question. What's the most pressing need for Ukrainians right now and for the post-war period when we reach that?
I think those are two different questions.
Yeah.
Obviously the most pressing need now is supplies of weapons and other capabilities, as well as security commitments from European partners in the United States. We probably should have brought some copies, but we forgot, of a report, very short report, which is a 7-point plan put out by my organization, CEPA's advisory group, that is co-chaired by the former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, and former Secretary of Defense, Minister of Defense of Germany under Angela Merkel, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, and many others who know Ukraine very well. And that really outlines what needs to happen now. And the first priority is to, one, impose more pressure on the Russians to actually show up at the table in a sincere negotiating stance, which they currently are not, and we're certainly not doing that right now, to be clear. But the second and equally important part is ramp up material, personnel, training, equipment, ammunition, and defense investment into Ukrainian defense industry, which is out-innovating and outpacing most defense capabilities in Western countries right now and beyond, because they're testing things in theater in a way that we've never tested a lot of our capabilities and equipment. So that's number one. Give the Ukrainians the ability to defend their country and to get on the offense when it comes to the Russian invasion, to be able to at least hold the line, because we're not really talking about, unfortunately, anymore about Ukrainians being able to take back a lot of the occupied territory. It's not impossible, but at this point in the war, it would be incredibly difficult without additional forces. And certainly, we haven't seen much incentive or impetus from Europeans or Americans or others to send boots on the ground. So that's the most urgent need. Then in terms of what would be the next steps in the post-war scenario, well, of course, if there is some sort of negotiated line, that line has to be enforced. We have seen what happens in Ukraine and other places where you have a negotiated agreement, this quote unquote freezes the conflict, but doesn't have a defense and deterrence mechanism behind it. And we've also seen examples of when a line of contact is negotiated through an agreement and it keeps and is effective. And the difference between these two scenarios, whether there's constant violations that probably eventually lead to another military aggression by the Russians once they have a chance to rebuild and remobilize their military, versus a stable line of contact in which the Ukraine-controlled part of Ukraine can develop and make their own decisions about their future. The difference between those two scenarios is whether you have boots on the ground from an international force to defend and deter any potential incursions. In this case from the aggressor, but it's obviously from both sides. This is the setup we had during the division of Germany in the Cold War period. And this is also what has been very effective in Korea. There's 30,000 troops on the border between North and South Korea, US troops. That is the only reason why there hasn't been a reemergence of war on the Korean Peninsula. So these are the things that Europeans are now thinking about because they've been forced into thinking about it over the last week. And there is movement in terms of a willingness to commit those kinds of troops and boots on the ground, but it's very clear that without a US backstop, we can talk about what that means and what it is and why it matters. This will not be an effective deterrence force or an effective defense force for that matter. So these are the more nuanced conversations that are happening right now. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for being here. I'm Zuri Sonde, an undergraduate student at Howard University. So I wanted to ask about the thousands or millions of Ukrainians who have left or settled elsewhere, and what do you think about the possibility or the likelihood that they will come back in the event of a post-war situation? And if they don't return, or if they don't return in the same numbers as they left, how would that affect Ukraine economically, especially as it's trying to rebuild?
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course, it's very difficult to predict. The numbers are not as clear as they used to, but there are millions of Ukrainians that are living outside of Ukraine, primarily in European countries. There's a lower number here in the United States, but mostly it's in Poland and countries spread out throughout Europe. How many will come back? Well, I can tell you that in the first months of the war, the ones that left thought they were going to come back in a couple of weeks, a couple of months. So families have been divided because men are not allowed to leave Ukraine because of martial law. So that means most of the people who are refugees outside of Ukraine are women and children, which usually means that they've been split up from other family members. And that's not really a sustainable situation. In fact, we've seen some, though again, it's really hard to know what proportion have returned permanently or just crossing the border back and forth to see family. But some have already returned, realizing that there's no clear end to the war, and that it's not really sustainable to live in a split family. And so some have returned and take get the sense, though again, this is very anecdotal evidence, we don't have any surveys of this question that you're asking, which is what you would need to answer the question. I think most would return, but of course a large proportion would not, because it's been 3 years. And after 3 years, you often establish a life elsewhere. You start putting down roots elsewhere. But I think if there was a stable and secure situation in Ukraine, I would guess that the majority of the Ukrainians would return. If they were certain that there would be a hard enough security commitment that, you know, their children would be put at risk again, their homes would be destroyed by Russian missiles again. So again, security in the post-war scenario and how Ukraine can be secured through a negotiation potentially of some kind is really the key question that would answer your question. But I think my sense is the majority would want to return and build their country, because patriotism as a result of this war has been extremely high among Ukrainians, and these people didn't want to leave. They don't want to leave, they want to come back.
Hi, my name is Will, and I'm a master's student at GW here. I'm curious to have your perspective on the economic situation. So say, the fighting has stopped and there's some sort of security peace. I think it seems to me that the Ukrainian economy will be in a difficult position because it'll probably be important to build up their own industrial base, while also rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding housing, and just rebuilding sort of the civilian side. So how, or is it possible, or how could they sort of balance building up, spending money on the military side, while also rejuvenating the civilian?
Yeah, some of the estimates suggest that reconstruction costs would be around $500 billion. I think that is an underestimate. Likely it's going to be much higher than that. Obviously, the longer the Russian attacks go on, the higher the cost will be. So it's definitely a challenging question. To my mind, the only way that Ukraine can really jumpstart its economy while at the same time investing in some defense capability is through investment from foreign investment, basically, from European companies, American companies, governments to a certain extent. But this is really going to be a private sector conversation. And there have been now, I've lost track of how many, but quite a few Ukraine Recovery and Reconstruction Conferences. I think the next one is taking place in Rome this summer to have this very conversation. What are the mechanisms that international financial institutions have, like the World Bank, the IMF, the European, actually let's break that. Anyways, the European Bank for Reconstruction, what these financial institutions can offer in terms of loans to rebuild critical civilian infrastructure, homes, roads, hospitals, electrical grids, all of that. And then the other hand, I think there's huge investment opportunities for the private sector in the defense space. Again, there's a huge need in Europe to spend more on defense. But even with the budget, there's no defense industrial base to produce and resupply NATO member states, European NATO member states. We can buy from the United States, but the timelines for buying U.S., highly sophisticated U.S. equipment are so long. It's like 25-year wait to get, a plane. And so our defense industrial base in the U.S. is not prepared to resupply all of Europe, even if, let's say, every European country now decides they're going to spend 5% of GDP in defense and security, which they're far, far from that. That's a huge amount of money, but where does that money get spent on? We don't have the ability to supply Europe at the speed that's needed. But Ukraine does. They have had to build out defense industrial base. Are they able to build, F-35s and massive tanks and other sophisticated equipment? No. But what are they able to build? Well, the things you actually need to fight this war, which is all kinds of drone capabilities, both in the air and sea and the land domains. And this is really the big gap in many European defense ministries as well, where there's not a huge amount of innovation that's being integrated into defense investment. So to my mind, Ukraine can become the defense industrial base for Europe. There's enough investment, co-production. Again, there's a huge amount of know-how that is coming out of Ukraine. And the companies that are there on the ground now that have taken on the risk of operating in Ukraine are the ones that are benefiting the most in terms of being able to integrate those innovations from battle-tested capabilities into their own product lines. And these will be the companies that will make the most money, frankly, when there's some stability, because they'll have the most up-to-date, most cutting-edge capabilities. And that is true both for hardware and software too, because let's not forget that the wars that's being fought in Ukraine is this sort of combination of World War I, trench-style warfare that's really brutal, and what we tend to think of as drone warfare, but it's a bit more complicated than that. So there's a combination of these two things happening on the ground. And looking ahead, this is also where Europe can move very quickly. If you have the kinds of increases in defense budgets that I was mentioning, well, what should you be buying with that money that can be produced really, really fast and pretty cheaply? It's drones. And I think this is hopefully where the thinking is heading. How do you actually build out future force capabilities while at the same time building out what's going to take a lot longer, which is defense industrial capability to produce munitions, for example, light armored vehicles, trained soldiers. That takes a long time. But building drones, buying drones, that takes some time at all.
Yep, but
my name is Yasmin. I'm with the Engineering High School. So the Trump administration is discussing control over Ukrainian minerals. Do you think this is a negotiating tactic to make territory compromises seem more appealing in exchange for sovereignty over resources? Or do you see this as a further threat to economic development and resource sovereignty after the war?
We don't know. We don't know what's in this deal. I mean, everyone's asking, about this supposed deal, but all we know is that the Trump administration has said that they want access and control over half of Ukraine's critical minerals. I don't know what that really means, honestly. It's not like these things are sitting there. You can just go in, scoop them up, and put them in a truck or something. You have to actually do exploration studies. You have to mine for a lot of these minerals. It's not clear what the cost would be of that, what the investment that would be needed would be, what the security situation would be, because I don't think, it's not that the US government is going to go in and do this, it'll be private companies that do this. And most private companies are not willing to invest the kinds of money you would need to carry out these operations without a security guarantee. Like, why would you, if you think, well, I'll just set up a very expensive mine when you might get hit by a Russian missile? It just doesn't make any sense. So again, if you have a security guarantee that would allow for the exploration of these resources, then maybe there's a conversation to be had there. But my sense is that the reason that the Ukrainians rejected this offer, if you want to call it that, is because it didn't come with any security guarantee. And I think that is the big question right now. Will the U.S. basically come back to the table and say, like, we still want this, but if you're going to sell away your mineral and critical deposits, here's what we're going to offer you, just to make sure that companies, actually are able to do the work. Because right now, the main problem is insurance for companies to go in. Again, because of the things I mentioned, it's really hard to get insured, or it's just very, very expensive. And there's not that many insurance providers that are willing to allow for very expensive business ventures in a war environment. So again, it's like, what is the sequencing here, right? Whether the Trump administration is prepared to have that kind of negotiation, I don't know. We're hearing very different things from different parts of the administration, honestly. It's hard to know where the policy is. My sense is that the reason why there's this fight unfolding between President Trump and President Zelensky is all because of this deal. Because the Americans, we went in and said, we'll just take half of your resources. And the Ukrainians said no, and now we're trying to bully them into saying yes. Again, whether that will, there's a conversation about the kinds of security guarantees and commitments we need. I think that's a different discussion, and I don't know if it's happening right now. So it's hard to answer the question because it's ongoing and we don't have a lot of detail about what has actually been discussed, is being discussed, why the deal was rejected. My guess is because it had no security guarantees attached.
There's sometimes chatter that the Chinese might want to make a play on Ukraine, given the hardline stance of the current administration. How possible do you think a scenario in which they mediate a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine is?
That's a really interesting question, and I think there's a real possibility that if this strange dynamic between the US and Ukraine continues, that the Ukrainians themselves will go to the Chinese and ask them to come in. There's huge opportunity here for China strategically. One, if they suddenly negotiate a deal with the Ukrainians that allows them some access to resources, including infrastructural resources like ports. Ukraine is a Black Sea nation. China has been very focused on getting access to trading ports in Europe. On the Mediterranean, I think they would love to have access and control over a seaport in the Black Sea, which they don't currently have. And where they can also project power across the region in all kinds of different ways. And there's a lot of incentive there. There's also potential incentive for investment, as I mentioned. Ukraine is a very rich natural resource country. It just needs to be developed, right, in the appropriate way. So I think it's a huge risk. And if the Chinese are able to come in, they will have a significant foothold in Europe as a result, and a significant foothold in European security going forward. It would be a smart play if I was in Beijing to be looking at this and to be reaching out to the Ukrainians as we speak. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Just hands here.
Well, as we could hear from the Trump administration, they don't support Ukraine joining NATO. Is there any alternative for Ukraine to join another alliance, or is it just not?
Well, I mean, to be clear, neither did the Biden administration. If we were going to make a play for Ukraine and NATO, it could have happened many times over. And there was a big campaign and push by NATO allies to get the White House there ahead of the Washington NATO summit last year, and it was the White House that said no, together with Germany. These are the two countries that blocked any movement on a NATO invitation for Ukraine. You can argue whether that would have made sense anyways, like what's a NATO invitation? What does that really mean when a country's at war? How do we manage that? Well, those details potentially could have been worked out afterwards. But the intent to even allow for that invitation to be given, to just have negotiations, not you're in NATO the next day, that's not how this works. That could have happened, and it didn't. And this administration, I think, has a very similar stance. I think the problem is that they've communicated it in a very unhelpful way. Because to my mind, the conversation around NATO's open door policy should not be on the table for a conversation on how to potentially settle Russia's war against Ukraine. That should be a conversation that's completely separate. Because that's not just a conversation about Ukraine, it's about NATO expansion more broadly. And potentially changing NATO's open door policy, which the Russians should have no say in that. They're not a NATO member state. It should be only NATO member states that decide whether there's a change that should be made to NATO's policy of the open door. So I think this is where the narrative is very bizarre, because it's basically the Russians dictating NATO policy, saying we don't want open door, we don't want Ukraine, presumably Moldova and Georgia and whoever else decides to petition for NATO membership, and closing that off completely. That's not how this should work. What the White House should have done, maybe is doing and will do, I don't know, is say, we will talk about a peace deal for Ukraine, but we're not going to talk about NATO. That's a conversation that can be had in a different format for the future, because that concerns all the NATO member states, not just the United States. I don't think that's what they're doing right now, but that's the right way to proceed, rather than letting a third party and an aggressor state dictate NATO's own policies vis-a-vis Ukraine or other nations, which is what the Russians have been wanting forever. And rhetorically, we have given them that already by closing the door and taking that chip out of our own negotiating position before we were even at the table to have a negotiation and talk about what chips we give away and which ones we don't. So we weakened our hands significantly by doing that, by stating it very publicly and directly. Even though, no surprise, everyone knew that this administration would not support Ukraine for entering NATO, neither did the Biden administration.
If NATO is off the table, what do you think about the possibility of Ukraine trying to develop nuclear weapons?
Well, there was a part of the earlier question about is there any other alliance structure that Ukraine could join that would provide a security guarantee to NATO? Not on paper. I mean, there's no alternative to NATO. Some people make the argument that Ukraine's EU accession is de facto a security guarantee. I would disagree with that because there's no force behind the EU. There's no European EU army. There's no defense capability there. At the end of the day, NATO is effective because it's a defense and security alliance that relies on armed forces. On your question about nuclear weapons, this is certainly something that's been in the conversation in Ukraine. I think the main message from the Russian invasion, not just to Ukraine, but basically every country across the world, is that you need nuclear weapons to retain sovereignty. I don't see any other way how any of this can be interpreted, because if Ukraine had its nuclear capabilities, which it gave up voluntarily in 1994, in exchange for sovereignty guarantees from the Russians and the Brits and us, and then of course the Russians broke that agreement, the Bucharest Memorandum it was called, because it had no enforcement mechanism behind it, so it didn't cost them anything to break it. But the Ukrainians had their nuclear capabilities. Ukraine was, I think, the third largest nuclear power, if I'm not mistaken, after the fall of the Soviet Union. I think we wouldn't be looking at a war in Ukraine right now. And that conversation of whether Ukraine should be developing its nuclear capabilities again, they certainly have the capacity because they used to house nuclear weapons. They have the human capital and expertise still in terms of nuclear scientists. They could do it. They just need the raw materials, right? They could build that. Certainly that's probably not in the interest of the United States to have a nuclear Ukraine. And it's a very sensitive conversation. However, the conversation happening now in Europe is whether there needs to be a nuclear European umbrella. Because of course there are nuclear states within Europe, France being a big one, the UK being another one. And these countries have also relied on the US umbrella. And there hasn't been the appropriate structure to have a European nuclear shield. And this is where the conversation is heading now. And Ukraine has to be part of a nuclear shield. But we're far away from that right now. That conversation is really just a conversation. It's really just about Europe. But I think there's an awareness among European leaders that if the situation keeps devolving like it is right now, then of course the Ukrainians will be thinking about this. And for them to avoid having a nuclear Ukraine, which I think makes people uncomfortable because the Russians are right there, but that's an easy way to get into a nuclear confrontation. And then you have to think about extending a European nuclear umbrella over Ukraine too. I think that's the only way, and that may be an alternative security commitment to NATO. But this is like this is hypothetical, like this isn't real right now to be clear, but this is a conversation that is happening. I think the Ukrainians will do what they have to do to retain their sovereignty, and potentially I could see them developing their nuclear weapons in the future.
If there are no questions, I would like to ask you, could you please give us an example of what would be the most important policy for Ukraine in security domain, in economic domain, and humanitarian domain? As for now, as like the situation as it is, and hopefully if you can also say it's a bit imaginative example, but in the post-war scenario. So what should Ukraine prioritize right now and after the war in these three domains?
So is the question about Western policy vis-a-vis Ukraine on those domains, or
Maybe national policy.
so Ukraine's own policy?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's hard to answer that question because Ukraine is dependent on military and security assistance from the West. Ukraine cannot produce its needs from the war itself, right? All these weapon systems, they can produce a lot of drones, millions and millions of drones now, but they can't produce a lot of other stuff like Patriot systems, right? I mean, these are this intellectual property of U.S. defense industrial companies. So, I mean, that's why Ukraine is a very difficult situation right now, right? Because they do need those capabilities. There's very few countries that can produce those kinds of capabilities. And very few companies that produce those kinds of capabilities. There's basically one, there's one company that produces Patriots, de facto. So I think when we're thinking about what Ukraine's own policy should be, I'm not the best person to answer that, because I think Ukrainians have to answer that. I'm not Ukrainian anymore. So I think that really, to my mind, is a question that has to be answered by the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian people. What we have to answer for our side is how important is Ukraine to our own security and the future international order. And I think that question that's urgently important, which I believe that it is, because the implications go far, far beyond what happens in the Donbass. The implications are global in nature. They certainly have huge implications for what happens in the Indo-Pacific and what the lessons learned for China are, and whether China will emerge as the big winner from this, which I think is highly likely, in all kinds of different ways. One could even say they already won the war, thanks to the Russians starting it. I think the questions that I would be looking to answer more about what do we need to do and how do we define the importance and urgency with which we need to act if we want to avoid what I think is a possible worst case scenario where we continue to have fighting in Ukraine and we have a confrontation with China in the Indo-Pacific. That is a two-front war that we actually can't handle, and we have set ourselves up in that direction. And Europe right now can't handle that kind of security commitment to support Ukraine, while at the same time resupplying its own capabilities in the defense side. So it's probably not a satisfying answer, but of course winning the war is number one. That's number one for Ukraine, that's number one for the West. Should be a number one priority. And we can debate what winning looks like. It can't be a peace deal if it comes with clear security and defense and deterrence guarantees for Ukraine, and economic investment opportunities, as well as aid, loans, credit, all of that kind of stuff. But we're just so far away from thinking about, I think, anything beyond what happens now. Because everything will be determined by how the war ends and if it ends. And all the other questions are almost secondary to that.
We have time for one last question, so if maybe we can collect. Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry if I might be, I was a little late in this, so I'm not even sure what you said, but how can, one thing I'm a little concerned about is like, for when like Ukraine inevitably does have to like go through like their post-reconstruction efforts, like how can Ukraine and international partners assure that like the wealth that flows into Ukraine's like reconstruction doesn't go into the hands of like a few private individuals who or I suppose oligarchs is the best way to describe it. Like the wealth doesn't end up in only the hands of just the oligarchs, but also the benefits are more distributed across Ukrainian society.
Should I take that? Should I collect? I think there's maybe one more question.
Would you want now?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, my name is Alex Rosa. I'm president of the Alexander Critical Society. We heard earlier from Alina Polyakova that in order for the Europeans to change the way things are going,
Can you speak up a little bit? Or... I want to make sure I hear your question.
So we heard from Ian Brzezinski that his proposal for the Europeans to change the way the winds are blowing vis-a-vis the Trump administration would be to offer to put 2 divisions or a sizable force in Ukraine and basically ask the U.S. to contribute a little bit in order to get a more favorable peace deal potentially in the future. I'm curious what you think about that proposal for European policy.
Yeah, this is the backstop that people are talking about. And it is true that the Europeans want to carry the load of providing the defense and deterrence force. That's where the conversation is right now. The question is, do the Europeans have it? And how many people, soldiers, troops do you actually need? I've been having this conversation with military planners because it's a very long contact line. So how do you secure that line? You know, some people have put out crazy exorbitant numbers, including the Ukrainians, saying you need a million men to hold the line. Okay, that's not happening, right? But the Ukrainians are right, they should push for the maximum and know they're not gonna get there. Then we've had others say, well, okay, you need 200,000 in the German view. There's no 200,000 troops in Europe to be sent to Ukraine. They don't exist. And my question was, is that real? Because I think that number is so large, both of them, that becomes an excuse for inaction. Say, well, we can't do that, throw your hands up in the air, find some other solution. But we don't have it, we won't secure the line. My answer to that is one, I don't think it requires that many troops. If you look at Mike Kaufman, who's a great military analyst, I asked him to post something on his Twitter that actually analyzes capabilities, and he finally did. And he said that you really only need 45,000 to 50,000 troops with a combination of, surveillance capabilities, drone capabilities, all of that. That can be behind the Ukrainian troops, right? So you have a multi-layer defense line, not a single-layer defense line. But why do you need the U.S. backstop? Well, because deterrence only works if the aggressor believes that, if they kill the troops that come after the Ukrainians, that there'll be some repercussions for that. And what it would take for Europe to deliver that 45 to 50,000 would be the entire European forces, basically. Meaning they would probably have to move some European forces that, because of NATO commitments, are stationed across Europe already. So there's like some German troops in the Baltics, for example. There's all kinds of bilateral relationships at the NATO level where you have troops from one country serving in rotational function other places. All of that would have to move to Ukraine. So the rest of Europe is pretty vulnerable. You could say for the short term until you can actually train up more troops and redeliver and reposition. and you need that U.S. presence. What that looks like can be quite minimal because it's actually more symbolic than anything. Because if a Russian missile kills 10 U.S. soldiers, that's a huge deal, right? And there will be repercussions for that, and everyone knows that, and the Russians know that. So that's why Ian is saying what he's saying, that if the Europeans want to get real, they'll say, here are the troops we have, we're ready to send them to Ukraine. What we need from you is, I don't know, what you already have in Poland, just put them in Ukraine, right? It doesn't mean new commitments, or it doesn't have to mean, infantry. It can mean air support, right? It can mean special forces. It can mean trainers and logistics operators for all the U.S. equipment that's there, which currently is getting sent outside of Ukraine to get repaired. It makes no sense. The whole logistics of the war make no sense. So it's thinking through more at a nuanced level what it looks like. But of course, I don't think the White House is thinking that kind of nuance at the moment. So I agree with Ian that if there's a visit coming up next week with the UK Prime Minister and the French President here in Washington. I hope they'll come and put some numbers on the table and say, here's how much money we can commit, here's how much we're going to spend on defense, here's what we're going to buy from you, America, to ensure that we have a capable defense force, and here's what we're going to put on the ground in Ukraine. But here's what we need your help to ensure that we can actually do what we're going to do. We're committed to it, and it's not going to cost you anything extra. I think has to be the bottom line. It's the unfortunate reality we're in, but I think this is where we are. But I agree with Ian. I think that's the way to do it, and hopefully that is what the European leaders are coming here to negotiate around. The question around corruption. I think that was the question. How do you ensure that whatever resources are provided to Ukraine aren't used in inappropriate ways and don't end up in the hands of the few? Look, I mean, Ukraine has become a really transparent country, actually. And all of our foreign assistance, to the extent that we've had foreign assistance in this country, comes with a lot of reporting, a lot of guardrails, a lot of audits. Like, this money isn't just doled out and then no one knows what happens to it. There's a lot of reporting that happens, a lot of transparency that happens. Ukraine has one of the most transparent, not the most transparent procurement system. It was launched before the full-scale invasion for all government procurement. You can literally go online and put in a grant, this is at the domestic level, and see where the money is, how it's being spent. There has been an effort in the Ministry of the Economy in Ukraine before the full-scale invasion to do the exact same thing for any foreign assistance grants. It's very expensive, it's complicated, it didn't get off the ground because the war started, but this is where we should be heading, is making sure that whatever funding comes has very clear transparency and accountability measures. And we should do that for every dollar that the US spends, honestly, in any sort of foreign assistance program, because it matters. But, there's also a reality that in every country, certainly not just Ukraine, there's always going to be efforts to siphon funds, to use them inappropriately. I think the risk in Ukraine is so high for that to happen, and the civil society is so on edge that there are watchdogs that have been set up. Unfortunately, a lot of them were funded by the USAID to ensure that, to monitor corruption, report corruption, to call people out, to monitor how funds are being spent. And it is real. Like, Ukraine's media go after Ukrainian officials for corruption, and then they have to resign. There's scandals all the time over things like that we don't even think about. I mean, we do this too, actually. There's a scandal in Ukraine about the cost of eggs in the Ukrainian military. Apparently, the Ukrainian military was buying eggs at some ridiculous cost that was 10 times the actual cost of an egg to feed their soldiers. The U.S. military does this too. The Pentagon literally pays 5 times more for a toothbrush and everything else because it's all happening through third-party contractors who take cuts. If you look at the defense budget, it's kind of crazy how much like basic things cost that you can go buy in a store for like half that price, if not less than that. So we also have to have some understanding that these things happen everywhere, whether you call it corruption, you call it third-party fees. You know, it's all kind of ends up in the same outcome, which is things cost more and they don't have to. But I think again, the way to monitor that is to ensure there's transparency and accountability measures built into all these projects. And you have to accept some percentage of misspent funds. I think that has to be an assumption in our own government too, right?
Of course.
So I think I just wouldn't single out Ukraine as the country that has the biggest problems with this. I don't think it is. I think it has a very watchful and very angry civil society that calls people out, that is doing investigative work, and people are angry. You know, they're angry if their military isn't helping and supplying their soldiers, and they call the government out on it, and then people resign. And we've seen some of this happen in the Ukrainian government last couple of years, where there's some shuffles. But the reason is that as soon as someone is found out to be siphoning, there's so much political pressure and they resign. And they're basically pushed out, they're fired. So actually Ukraine is not the worst offender here, that's what I would say. But certainly it's a concern that needs to be mitigated against.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry we're running out of time, but let's give a round of applause for Let's hope for the negotiations next week as they start with the European leaders here in DC. We'll have a chance to see how the things are going to happen going forward. Please accept our certificate of appreciation. We appreciate your time and the fact that you were with us today. Thank you very much for being here and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's the first time I've gone one of these from AHS.
Oh.